I just want to say I am very excited to be here this morning. I feel like we're in a weird spot right after family camp, right before NYC. So there's two major events, and usually when you're super busy, and then there's finally a break, and it's rest. But at the same time, God, just because this isn't NYC, just because this isn't family camp, doesn't mean God can't do a super incredibly powerful move of God today. Today, I'm going to have you all be seated. I'm going to start off a little differently than normal. Typically, we get up here and whoever's speaking reads a verse. We stand in honor of the word. And then they explain it, and they very eloquently deliver this amazing Bible lesson. Pastor and Sister Green give great explanations, and revelation comes, Spirit of the Lord falls. I am not Sister Green. But I do believe I have a word from God for you guys today. And I have titled this study I've done, Nailed It. So, does anybody in here ever work with building thing or nails, like nails, like those sharp nails you hammer things into? All of you are in the same boat as me. This is great. So my freshman year of college, worked at Menards, which, if you know me, I am very stereotype girl. That is not where you would expect me to work. I just was looking for a job. My friend got me an interview. They were hiring. And I walked in and I told them up front, I do not know anything about these things that you sell. I will be honest about that, but I do know how to work a cash register. So they gave me the job, and there would be a few times an item would come in without a receipt. And I would have to call that department and tell them what was missing, and they would look up the price so I could type it in. And there'd be quite a few times where something would come through like a piece of wood. And they'd be like, what kind of wood is it? It is rectangular and brown. There was sometimes there'd be a little plumbing item, or there'd be a nail. So I'd call hardware and be like, we have a nail and I don't have a price on it. What kind of nail is it? It is sharp and silver. It's a little bit shiny. And a lot of times they would give me a breath of grief, and I could hear it. I could hear them asking the Lord for patience. I made a lot of people spiritual that weren't. And I would just be like, you guys hired me. I told you. You can't blame this on me. I'm just acknowledging. I told you in the beginning. So I don't know much about nails. But something hit my spirit this week at family camp, and as Brother Woodward on Thursday morning was teaching on the cross and what that truly meant, I kept hearing the noise of a nail. And if you weren't there at family camp, I highly encourage you to go back and listen to it. Reverend Woodward is one of my personal favorite teachers to listen to. And my husband mocked me because I was having a hard time not fangirling and remembering he's a human being. And it was great. I was so excited to meet him because I look up to his study methods. But while he was teaching, I kept hearing a nail being hit. I kept hearing that noise, and I kept hearing, trust me. And God brought me to this study and prompted me to start looking at what is the significance of a nail. And I looked up nails are, the word nail, nailing, nails are in the Bible 21 times, but in 19 verses, because a couple verses use them twice. And there are 7 different versions between the Hebrew and Greek words that are used for the word nail, and every single one of them just means nail. There's nothing exciting. I was a little disappointed about that, so I was like, okay, that's usually how I study things, so if that's all it is, why did you prompt me to look up the significance of a nail? And so God brought me to a few different stories that I'm going to walk through with you guys today. And I truly believe God has a message for us to hold in our hearts with this. I'm going to open up in Judges chapter 4. And I have quite a few verses, but if you guys want to stand for the reading of at least this initial word, I'll let you sit down for the rest. Judges chapter 4, verses 4 through 9. And Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, so she judged Israel at that time. And she dwelt under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel and Mount Ephraim. And the children of Israel came to her for judgment. And she sent and called Barak, the son of Abinoam, son of Kiddush, and said unto her, Had not the Lord of Israel commanded, saying, Go and draw toward Mount Tabor, and take with them 10,000 men of the children of Naphtali and the children of Zebulun? And I will draw unto thee the river Kishon, Sisera, the captain of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude, and I will deliver them into thine hand. And Barak said unto her, If thou wilt go with me, then I will go. But if thou wilt not go with me, then I will not go. And she said, I will surely go with thee, notwithstanding the journey that thou shalt take, not be for thine glory. For the Lord shall sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. And Deborah arose, and she went to Barak to Kiddush. You may be seated. So at this point, I have heard this story of Deborah and Barak taught several times, and I think I've mentioned before this part of the story, where a lot of times preachers will talk about he wouldn't go without Deborah, and he refused to go. Now I've heard a couple different explanations of why. There's been one hypothesis that he was being a little bit sexist, saying, well, if you want me to go so bad, you come with me. And I don't believe that was the case, because in the ancient times, it was very common tradition where they were when a soldier went into battle to bring something of spiritual significance to him. It wasn't uncommon for them to bring a prophet or prophetess. So just because she was the judge over Israel, the one running everything, the Bible says she was also a prophetess. So it's very natural that somebody in a line of work that is called to bring your spiritual leader in the battle with you as support would want her to come. The thing is, its glory is not going to be for his, but for the glory of a woman, because the woman is the one that received the word from God for him to go. She acknowledges another word that he's already heard. She acknowledges, has God not told you to go do this thing? He wasn't doing it. She had to prompt him. Now, I don't know how many, if everyone in this place has had the same experience, but a lot of married people, the wife will tell the husband to do something, and then you have to remind him. When I grew up with my brother, my mom would tell him to do something, and a lot of times she had to remind him, and that's okay. Not all guys and girls are like that, but, it is a common thing that happens quite a bit. Later on in the story, when you go down to 13 through 22, and Sisera gathered round together his chariots, and I'm going to sum this up. Sisera is running in the battle against Israel. At one point, his country took over the Israelites, put them in captivity. Now they're fighting back. There's a war. Sisera is leading the enemy's army, and he has 900 chariots. However, Deborah, leading over Israel, sends Barak and goes with him, and they have 10,000 men. 900, 10,000. Now, there have been upsets in the Bible before. However, those don't look like great odds. And they have God on their side. So not only do they have the majority, they have that. And so what happens is it says in verse 17, Howbeit Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. So he runs away to a friend's tent. And Jael went out to meet Sisera and said unto him, Turn in, my lord, turn in to me, fear not. And when he had turned in unto her tent, she covered him with a mantle. Verse 19. And he said unto her, Give me, I pray thee, a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. And she opened a bottle of milk and gave him the drink and covered him. Again he said unto her, Stand in the door of the tent, and it shall be, when any man doth come and inquire of thee and say, Is there a man here? Thou shalt say, No. Then Jael, Heber's wife, took a nail of the tent, and took a hammer in her hand, and went softly unto him, and smote the nail in his temples, and fastened it to the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary, and so he died. Now, when I hear nail in the Bible, there's two stories I generally automatically jump to. I jump to the cross, and then I jump to Jael, the woman who is infamous for murdering a man with a nail. And I didn't understand, because I felt like these two stories, while I was hearing the nail this week play in my head, I was trying to understand why these two stories come to mind, what connects them. And in this story, I found a little bit of a historical study that I think helped me. Back in the Israelites' days, in the Bible times, tents were set up. That's how they lived. That's how they often had to pack up and travel and move along. And they were made of goat hair, and they had these patches they laid up, and they had posts holding them up, and they would use nails to tie everything together. And I knew that, but on the inside, there was a brickwork, or if they couldn't afford brick or it was too heavy to carry and they traveled a lot, it would be clay. And they would build these to hold up the centerpieces, and they would use curtains of some sort, whether more animal hair or fabric, and they would tie up curtains to make little rooms inside of the tent because they were living there. So when you first walked into a tent back in those days, you would walk into a big room for the men and that guests would be welcomed into. That was like the living room. And then you'd walk farther back into the tent, and there would be a room for the women and for the children. And it was a common custom. I never understood why he said, if someone tells you there's a guy here, just say no. I'm like, oh yeah, they're searching for a God, and they'll just be like, okay, we're not going to look here, bye. That's not how that works. But when you study the historical facts of it, a woman, her tent was a private, safe space. And because of all the differentiations between men and women in that day, nobody was to enter the tent of a woman without her permission. It was a custom, it was a law that was very well followed through. It was enforced. And so if you were not a woman or child, you were not allowed to walk into the tent as a man to the back room unless she said okay. And so by going into not only the tent of her family, but by moving into her apartment within the tent, that was an extra covering for him because they would have to take her word for it by their customs law. And so he does that, and then he goes back there. Not only does she take him to the safest spot in her house, she covers him with a blanket, and then he's probably terrified. I mean, he just fled a battle he was already losing. But then he asks for water, and she gives him milk. Cream was a rare thing that they couldn't always afford. That was a bigger deal. That was like asking somebody for their old clunker if you need a car and them handing you the keys to a Maserati or an Aston Martin or something. And so if you have something much better than what you asked for, he was lulled into a false sense of security. Not only does he already think I can trust this person, I'm going to break custom by going into the woman's tent of a woman I'm not married to or related to. I'm going to go where I'm not supposed to be. He's already not supposed to be on the run. As the head of his army, it is his responsibility to stand with his army, lose or win. And he's abandoned them in fear. And in fear, he is listening and choosing to trust this woman. A lot of times, the enemy will lull us into a false sense of security by giving us desires we want that God said no to. Things that go contrary to the word of God, and we think, oh, it's fine. I got what I wanted. And we're choosing what we want over what God said. And by already not serving God, by already going against God's people, and then choosing to bail on those people, his trust, his loyalty is only to himself. And so he's somewhere he's not supposed to be. And I began to think about, where do we go in moments of desperation when we feel hopeless, when we feel like there's no chance of surviving? If you come home and there's an eviction notice, if you come home and automatically just fall into a fight with someone you live with, tensions are already high. You come home with bad news from work. Where do you find that comfort from? Where do you seek it from? Do you just try to drown out the noise with entertainment? Do we try calling a friend to vent? Or do we seek the Lord and get on our knees and say, I can't do this without you? When we're scared, it can also change how we perceive things. Another custom at that time was there was a law of hospitality. And Sister Nettie would love this part, so I really hope she hears it. But when there was a law of hospitality, if you had someone into your home or in your tent, you automatically, if you accepted them in, you accepted a responsibility to protect them with your life. Now, understanding the layout of the tent explains a lot of Bible stories. It explains why when Abraham was talking to an angel, Sarah overheard them and laughed through her tent. It was a private space, but it was thin enough to hear. It explains that why when the Sodom and Gomorrahites tried to come to Lot's home, and they wanted to do wicked things with the angels that came to visit him, he pled with them to leave them alone and offered them anything else from his home. He offered them his family, which I wouldn't suggest doing that either. I'm not saying that was a great idea. But he was following the law of hospitality above loyalty to his family, and that was his choice. That was his priority in that case. We're going to jump to Ezra chapter 7. Ezra chapter 7, verse 10 says, "For Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord and to do it, and to teach Israel statutes and judgments." So Ezra is a man of God for the department of Israel, for the country of Israel. And he sends for men of understanding because Israel's in a tight spot. They've got enemies all around them. And in verses 21 to 23 in chapter 8, 21 through 23, he says, "Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might afflict ourselves before our God to seek him a right way for us, for our little ones, and to our substance. For I was ashamed to require of the king a band of soldiers and horsemen to help us against the enemy in the way, because we had spoken to the king, saying, The hand of our God is upon all of them for good that seek him. But his power and wrath is kindled against all that forsake him. So we fasted and besought our God for this, that he was entreated of us." He's not sure what to do. He's a man of God, so he calls for men of understanding. And they're praying. He calls for a fast together, and he's seeking what's best for their provision, for themselves, and for their children. But he says he was ashamed because he had to ask the king for protection. He gets together. They ask the king for a little extra safety, but then he feels ashamed because his faith wasn't enough to protect him during the fasting point. And he feels like my faith should have been higher. And in chapter 8, verse 31, he says, "Then we departed from the river of Ahava on the 12th day of the first month to go to Jerusalem. And the hand of God was upon us, and he delivered us from the hand of the enemy, and of such lay in wait by the way." When they're done with fasting, they start going home. They feel like they've got a direction from God, and God protects them. They didn't have to fear anything, and God keeps them safe. In chapter 9, Ezra 9, verses 1 through 3, the men of understanding come to Ezra with what they felt God answered them in prayer and what they've seen. And they said, "The Israelites have married non-believers, the enemy countries, these foreign nations that serve other gods. They've married their sons, they've married their daughters, they've let them in. And so that's why you guys are going to be judged unless something changes. God is bringing judgment towards you." And so chapter 9, verse 5, "And at the evening sacrifice I arose from my heaviness, and having rent my garment and my mantle, I fell upon my knees and spread out my hands unto the Lord my God." There was a quote at family camp, and I believe it was Brother Joel Urshan who said it, "When did praise become a poor man's game?" Why do we have to be in a place of desperation to hit that point in prayer where we're flat on the floor and we're weeping? That's not saying we have to pray that way every single day. There are days you're going to pray, jumping around, running the aisles, praising God for something he did and glorifying him. But when we're seeking God for something we need, or when we're seeking God on behalf of somebody else, we have to give him our all. And he's doing that. In chapter 6, verse 6, "And he said, O my God, I am ashamed and blush to lift up my face to thee, O God, for our iniquities are increased from our head, and our trespasses grown unto the heavens." He uses the word our transgressions. He's not the one that married somebody from a foreign nation. The people he led were, but he takes responsibility for them because he realizes if his people are being judged, he is their leader, the one who is supposed to be spiritually attuned and leading them. He feels like he's failed, and so he's taking responsibility for it, and he's telling God why he is weeping on their behalf. Ezra 9, chapter 7. He talks about how God's led them out of captivity in the past, but then he acknowledges we deserve it. But in Ezra 9:8, he says, "And now for a little space grace hath been showed from the Lord our God to leave us a remnant to escape, and to give us a nail in his holy place, that our God might lighten our eyes and give us a little reviving in our bondage." He ends the prayer on a positive note, but what does that exactly mean? Because King James is not exactly the easiest thing to equivalent to our today. He praises God for the grace he gives them to leave a remnant to escape. You are giving us a chance for freedom still. To give us a nail in his holy place. I'm going to get to that in a minute. That our God might lighten our eyes and give us a little reviving. You revive our soul, and a nail in a holy place is stability. A nail in the holy place of the temple is something that's going to stay. Now, there's a slight difference between the nail JL used and the nail in this case that he's referring to. The nails on the outside of the tent were hammered in. There's regular nails they carried with them. They had to build something with a hammer. The nails on the inside of the building, when you walked in, the posts that were holding the tent up on the inside, the pillars on the inside were made of brickwork or clay. And there were nails inside of them that they would use to hold up their things like spoons or clothing, and it would hold stuff up. It's where they would hang curtains or create their own windows or doors. There were nails holding things up, but they didn't just use a hammer because the hammer wouldn't go into brickwork. You can't hammer in a brick wall. And so what they would do is as they made this brick wall, they would bend the tip of the nail and put it in and get it caught, and they would, while they were making the brick, they would hold the nail in. It would be formed into the wall itself, and it would not be able to be moved. While they can take out the tents on the outside or pick up a loose nail if they have to use it or pack up and leave, that is staying in place, and that nail will not come out. That nail's in a safe spot. A nail in a holy place is a nail that is in a wall in the holy place of the tabernacle that is used to hold things up but will not be moved. There is no chance of any storm or any person just taking it out. It is there for good. It is a sense of stability. God, you are giving us a sense of stability because of your grace. Isaiah 43, chapter 40, verse 31. Isaiah 40:31. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew thy strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles, and they shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. The verse immediately after, though, because the Bible was not written in chapters and verses. Isaiah 41:1. Keep silence before me, O islands, and let the people renew their strength. Let them come near, then let them speak. Let them come near us in judgment. So he's talking about God renews our strength. In the original text, the word renew is actually change. Pastor Green has taught us. They shall change their strength. God will change the strength you have to sustain whatever it is he is allowing you to go through. So when he says, you will give us a remnant to escape, a nail in the holy place, you will lighten our eyes, and you will give us a little reviving. You will renew the strength and adjust our strength to be what we need. In 41:10, it says, Fear not thou, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee, yea, I will help thee. I will uphold thee with thy right hand of thy righteousness. God is the one that holds us up. God is the one that Sisera made the mistake of not serving. But Sisera turned the JL for support and for strength, not God. He turned to her for milk and provision, not God. That's where he messed up. Ezra knew to seek God for his strength. He knew we messed up. We're about to be in big trouble. Instead of hiding from God and running from him to something else or somebody else or another nation to back us up to try to protect us from God, because that's not going to happen, I'm going to acknowledge what we've done wrong and ask him for grace and for mercy. And my strength, and it says in Isaiah, comes from him. All of chapter 41 in Isaiah is about trusting God. If you are struggling with trusting God, I highly encourage you to read Isaiah 41 as a whole, because it reminds us of who he is, how he takes care of us, what he is here for. He is the one that, and it also talks about in 41 about he is the one that can do all these things. Idols were what they were looking to at that time. Sisera turned the JL. Israel and Isaiah was turning to idols, man-made things. And a lot of times we sit there going, oh, how dumb are you to worship a little statue? But how often do we idolize family over church? There's a family event. I can't possibly schedule it to visit my parents until after church is done. It has to be during. There's no other day in the entire year I can see my parents except for this time. This is more important to me. My job is more important to me because I'm going to trust my job for provision. And then if I lose it, then I'll come begging to God for help. I'm going to come home and rely on my family to be the one that supports me. I'm going to rely on my job to support me. I'm going to rely on my house. My house keeps me safe. I'm going to take it for granted, but if an eviction notice comes on the table. I'm going to rely on my car to give me transportation instead of thanking God for giving me the ability to travel. And we put our trust in man-made objects. We trust our car to get us somewhere safely. We trust our job to give us a paycheck. We trust our bank to keep our funds in account. And in chapter 41 of Isaiah, he reminds them they can't do that. Only I can. He reminds them that I'm the one that gives you strength. I give you hope for the future. I give you provision. I give you comfort. In Ecclesiastes 12:11, it says, "The work of the wise are as goads and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given by one shepherd." The words of the wise are the things that hold things in place. They're the ones that hold us in place. A nail is going to hold something. If you're using it on the outside of the tent, it's going to hold it down. If you're using it in that wall inside the tent, it's not coming out, and it will hold whatever you burden you cast on it. God is able to do that for us. And in chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes, in this passage, he is specifically talking about preachers. The words of a wise preacher are going to be what sustains us and holds things in place. The words of a man who is genuinely of God. We cannot seek comfort from other things of the world, because when we come to the house of God, we hear the words of a wise preacher. Isaiah 22, chapter 20, starts talking about high priests. Chapter 22, verse 20 says, "And it shall come to pass in that day I will call upon my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with thy robe and strengthen him with thy girdle, and I will commit thy government into his hand, and he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. And the key of the house of David will I lay upon his shoulder, so he shall open and none shall shut, and he shall shut and none shall open. And I will fasten him as a nail in a sure place, and he shall be glorious for a glorious throne to his father's house. And they shall hang upon him all the glory of his father's house, and the offspring and the issue, all the vessels of small quantity, from the vessels of cups, even unto all vessels of flagons. And that day, saith the Lord of hosts, shall the nail that is fastened in a sure place be removed, and be cut down and fall, and the burden that was upon it shall be cut off, for the Lord has spoken it." In this passage, he is talking about the high priest Shebna, which was removed from office. He is forcibly taken now, and a lot of scholars believe he was prideful and encouraging Israel to form an alliance with Egypt, which is not what God wants. And it talks about how Eliakim, his son, is the one God is choosing to put in place instead of him. And he says, I will give him this position to lead over all Israel. And I'm going to fasten his position like a nail in a sure place, not one of the loose nails on the outside of the tent, one of the ones inside in the sure place, molded into the pillar. What I put together, no man can put asunder. It cannot be removed. The glory of your dad, that your dad had, the glory of the position, the glory of God that you use and allowed to shine through you, is going to be hung up on you and your ministry, and to your sons and their sons and the generations until I remove it. Only God is strong enough to pull something spiritual, a spiritual nail out of a spiritual brick wall. Only he can take the glory that was shined upon it and put it upon himself. At family camp, if you heard Brother Woodward speak on Thursday morning, you know where I'm going with this. In Mark chapter 14, verses 61 through 63, the high priest is questioning Jesus, and it says when Jesus tells him, I am, he rents his clothes. But in Leviticus 21:10, there was a law forbidding any high priest of renting their clothes. Well, in a court of law telling Jesus he is guilty, he rents his clothes and breaks a law in front of everybody. And nobody says a word because they're all so preoccupied with what's going on with Jesus. None of them acknowledge that this man just broke a very sacred law in a court of law. And by doing so, he fulfills the word in Isaiah. The descendants of Eliakim will be in high priest until this moment, because by doing that in front of Jesus, he disqualifies himself. And by doing that, Jesus is the one, God gives Jesus the title of high priest. He is the one that receives all the glory, all of that, and he is the one that takes it on for himself as a nail in a sure place. I'm not going to read out of it, but in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel recaps a vision he had with all these beasts, and it talks about every beast represents a nation that will come against Israel and will take over, and is part of prophecies, and all of it was fulfilled at that point. The fourth beast, the last beast he mentioned seeing, is one that represents Rome. Rome comes the power, and they're the ones that end up crucifying Jesus for the Jews. In Colossians chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. Colossians 2, 13 and 14. And you being dead in your sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh hath he quickened together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. You guys want to know a really fun fact that I thought was awesome, which made up for the word nail not meaning anything cool in Hebrew or Greek? In Bible times, if they wanted, there was a law, or if there was something that passed legally and they wanted to annul it, you would nail it to a post. And that was how it was saying it was done. When Jesus nailed himself, he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He is the law. When he was nailed to the cross, that annulled the original covenant, that annulled the law, that fulfilled the law. It is done. I'm not removing myself from it. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. But it's not holding over you anymore. It's no longer relevant. That's annulled. And by nailing it to the cross, he brought us into the new covenant, into the covenant of forgiveness. In John chapter 20, verses 19 through 20. Then the same evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut and the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, came Jesus and stood in the midst and said to them, Peace be unto you. And when he had said so, he showed unto them his hands and his side. Then were the disciples glad, and they saw the Lord. Verses 24 through 29. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, which was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said unto him, We have seen the Lord. But he said to them, Except I see the hands, the print of the nails, and I put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into the side, will I believe. And after 8 days again came the disciples were within, and Thomas with them. Then said Jesus, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and said, Peace be unto you. Then said he to Thomas, Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands. Reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless and believing. And Thomas answered and said to him, My Lord and my God. Why is this something I felt relevant to walk through all these verses? In the beginning, I talked about Jael. Sisera was seeking comfort from somebody that was not God. Sisera was seeking comfort from somebody, from another person that was not the Lord. He was choosing her comfort over the comfort of God, and he chose to go into her tent. He chose to break all sorts of laws, all sorts of ethical, moral, custom laws. but yet expected another customs law of her telling them you can't come in to just be enough to protect him. It's funny when people want certain things to protect them conveniently when it's helpful for them, but yet they don't follow through. Ezra sought God for direction. He did better than Sisera. He didn't seek comfort or protection from somebody else. He sought wisdom from others. But he sought God and he fasted and he sought for the Lord and he acknowledged the captivity of the past. But he asked God to give them freedom to escape. He asked him for the stability like a nail in a high place. And not just any stability, a nail in a holy place. He didn't just say a nail in a shore place. He said a nail in a holy place. I want to be in your presence. I want stability in your presence. I wasn't always in church, and when I wasn't always in church, I lived with my parents, and they weren't in church, and they weren't supportive at that time of me being here, and I had to leave against their wishes, and it usually caused arguments quite often. And I had to choose to be here, and I was here, but I didn't really feel stable because I didn't know if something would happen. And if my car wasn't working, I would have to try to talk them into letting me use theirs, which sometimes was possible, sometimes was not. I didn't feel stable being here. I didn't feel like I could really take up any form of ministry to help with anything, to volunteer for anything, because I didn't know when something would change, when a relationship would change, and if it got changed for the worse, then I might not be able to show up. He asked God for a stability, and then he also asked God to lighten their eyes and to give them a little bit of reviving. We've heard stories about God raising the dead, but and we praise God for that. But how often do we think about God raising the spiritually dead? How often do we think about, God, I feel empty? Well, I'm not dead. Like, I still believe I'm still here. That doesn't count. Yes, it does. If you are injured, if you are at that point and we need reviving, he can bring it to us. He asked God to lighten their eyes, lighten our load. His yoke is heavy, but his burden is light. He asked him, Lord, there is a heaviness I am feeling. I'm not even the one that messed up, but I'm going to ask you to take this from us. And on their end, it was the result of a consequence they made. How often do we go to God and ask God to take up a burden that's a consequence of an action we chose? A lot of times, I've known a few people who are afraid to go to God for that. Well, I deserve it. This is my punishment. This is I made a mistake. I didn't listen. You can still take it to God. The way a child goes to his mom or dad and says, I did exactly what you told me not to, but now my foot's stuck in this chair and I need help. God can still pick it up, and he doesn't tire of that. He renews our strength that way only he can do. He is the only one that can strengthen and uphold us. No man-made item, no thing in this world that is not of God can take the place of what God can do. It's similar to the difference between a loose nail and a nail in a sure place. One is built into a pillar. We need to make sure we are connected to a pillar in the church. If we just come, and we come occasionally, and we don't plant any roots, we are giving ourselves full permission to walk out. The same way when I didn't feel stability in church, I didn't take up anything because I used the excuse, I don't know if I'll be able to, I don't know if I'll have the strength to argue enough to leave. I don't know if I don't want to commit to it. Because then I'm acknowledging I'm going to fight no matter what. And I feel like I'm already giving all I can give. And it's an excuse. But when we fasten ourselves to a pillar and we ask a pillar in the church, somebody who's been here a long time, it could be an elder who's been around for years, it could just be another individual in the church that you just look up to a lot, and you ask for accountability. I remember when I first was slowly getting further and further into God, I went to Sister Sheila and I asked her, I know how to pray, but I want to know how you pray, because I feel like I'm not doing it right. It doesn't always feel like I'm being answered, or I feel like I'm not as faithful with it as I could be. How do you pray? And she walked me through her method, and it's like, you don't have to do it exactly how I do it. But by opening up conversations and being honest about my vulnerabilities, it opened the door to, if I was struggling, to go to Sheila and not be afraid to talk to her, because I already opened a conversation. I began to go to certain other members of our church and ask and tell them, I'll see you next week. That was a big deal because in my head, I cannot say see you next week because I'd hear some people say it and say, mate, I'll see you later. Conveniently saying later because I don't know if I say see you next week and then I don't come next week, that's lying in the house of God. And I was terrified I'd get like smited if I said see you next week and didn't show up. Like I remember I said see you next week and then the next week I was like super sick and I was like, Lord, please don't smite me. I didn't mean to lie. But when we don't have that commitment, when we don't fasten ourselves, and because anybody can just stick to a wall. Anybody can just, hi, Sherry, how are you today? But when we build a relationship here, when we form ourselves and connect ourselves and build form a relationship with a pillar in this place, somebody that's stable, God can use that. And the thing is, like I said, only God is full stability. All of us are man. All of us are going to mess up at some point. I am sure I've disappointed somebody in this room, if not several of you, at some point. But when we put ourselves and we look to God and we form a relationship and put Him as our pillar and we have that deep relationship consistently, when we're not only building a relationship with God, when we're coming into the house of God to hear the wise words of a man of God who keeps us like a nail in a safe place, when we have relationships with the pillars in the church, that helps keep us connected. There's many parts to a tent. They don't just put up the brick thing and throw over a sheet and go, done. You need the rope to pull it out because otherwise you can't stand under it. You need the outside nails to hold it down. You need the stuff to go inside of it, the curtains, because otherwise all sorts of craziness can happen if there's no order. And we need to set that up. And when we remember all of these things, when we remember who God is, and we begin to look at the nails in the Bible, who is our nail? Who is holding us in place? Who is holding us in church? Who is holding us within the faith? Would we consider ourselves to be a loose nail that can easily be used with a hammer? Now, I'm telling you, if you're holding a nail, and I'm holding the mic, so I can't exactly demonstrate, but y'all are adults who can know this. If you're holding a nail with one hand, then you grab a hammer. If you're not used to it, there is a very high risk of you hitting yourself or missing the nail or hitting the nail wrong and it goes in sideways. I remember I tried helping Valentine with something once and he got really annoyed because I put it in sideways and he was like, I got it, honey. Just go watch the kids. So, and we put it in wrong. There's instability there. There's a risk. It's not precise. And it's often outside of the tent, nowhere near the pillar. Now, we need those tents on the outside. We need people who aren't connected to the pillar yet because it means the church is growing. If there are no loose nails in your church, you are not growing and you are doing something wrong because we aren't outreaching. But if we have but we shouldn't have the same loose nail out there all the time either. There should be a constant moving forward. But if we are a nail in a sure place, we are rooted in a pillar. We can stand through any weather. We can stand through any mistake. We can stand through any crisis. We're typically secured by a professional. Now, not all of us are professionals in Christ, but all of us have some experience with God in this house. So you're not just they're not just going to let anybody put the nail inside of the brick. They're going to find somebody who knows what they're doing and maybe have somebody watch to learn for the future. If everybody could stand. I would like to encourage everybody this week. I think there's a lot of nails and sure places in this house. But when you guys hear the story of Jesus, when you hear the story of J.L., when you see a nail, if you go home and you see a nail randomly on your dining room table or something, I don't know what kind of nice furniture you guys have. Maybe your nails are covered. I don't know. But when you see a nail somewhere, I want you guys to kind of smile to yourself and think, God is my nail in a sure place. God is the one that holds me in place, and be encouraged with that. If we could pray. God, you are great and you are mighty, and we thank you for the stability you provide for us, whether we deserve it or not. We thank you for always giving us a safe place to turn to, and we thank you for being our source of provision, our source of protection. And God, we love you and we serve you and you alone. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. You guys have about 15-minute break. I ended about 5 minutes early. But at 10:50, please remember your children.